My name is Kris Nielson. I'm a former teacher, parent, activist, author, blogger. My first book that I wrote was Children of the Core, which was kind of came out of my experiences as a teacher and as a parent of mostly teenagers. And I really wanted to expose to other parents in a way that wasn't full of jargon and all that stuff what's going on with their kids. There are lots of parents that would tell me, you know, I just have it in my gut that there's something wrong with school, and they couldn't put their finger on it, so that was my attempt to expose it. The more I went through teaching, the more I realized that so many kids, it doesn't matter what grade level, it doesn't matter what age, there are so many kids that just have a different way of doing things from other kids, and there's different rates that they do things and all this stuff. And I started actually getting into my head, turning into one of those weird progressive people that thought, you know, why do we even have grade levels? Why do we even have grades? Do we really need content standards to show this is where you have to be at this certain time, and the only way we're ever going to know about that is if we test you on it? And then I realized that Common Core is not only that, but it's nationally that. It's trying to get everybody on the same page and doing the same thing. And then I dug into it even more, and that's when you go down the rabbit hole. I actually love teaching. I actually, in Charlotte, North Carolina, I went to a very low-income rural school and taught there for a little while. It was about 85% people of color and I think 100% poverty. And I realized that from the affluent schools that I had taught at, and the difference between that and this school that I was now at, first of all, those were my favorite kids because they were kind of real and funny and goofy, but they were so downtrodden. It felt like I was teaching at a prison, and there was no way to get around that. It was my freedom as a teacher and their freedom as students to learn and learn from each other and just be kids was totally stripped. And it felt like I was working at a prison. I wasn't a school teacher anymore, I was a prison guard. First of all, it was a uniform school, which there's lots of those, but by grade level they were wearing sweatshirts of solid colors. There was blue, red, and yellow. So when we would take them out to the yard, the playground, whatever you want to call it, it looked like they were segregated by units, and we had to make sure that certain people weren't hanging out together. We had to surround them, kind of like guards would a prison yard. They weren't allowed to play sports. They weren't allowed to do certain other things. They stood there for about 10 minutes, talked, and then we took them back inside. I think it was just in the name of keeping them controlled. They didn't want to deal with any incidents. They didn't want to get them, you know, fired up. In between classes, they walked up and down the hall silently in lines. I mean, it was not a middle school in my book. The school I was working at used to be a segregated high school for black folks only. And then they were all excited because they finally desegregated this school and turned it into a middle school. But to me, it didn't feel like they really accomplished that goal. They were still treating these poor kids way differently than they were the upstate or the uptown white kids. They were free to go about the halls. They didn't have to have a teacher with them all the time. They weren't segregated into groups. They could hang out with whoever they wanted. They could play football. You know, it was a totally different feeling. You know, I think there's this feeling that you have to control certain kids in order to get them to do the things you want them to do. Think about rich white kids. They go in, they take a test on the first day of school, and they pass it right away. I mean, why are they even there? Other than to practice their test taking, because they do it really well. Where on the other hand, you have these kids who live in poverty who don't do that. They have other things to worry about, obviously, and the least of which is taking a test and doing well on it. Most of the time they had to worry about what kinds of drugs were going to be filtering around their neighborhood, what kind of violence was going to happen around. I mean, this was a little rural town outside of Charlotte, but it had some serious urban-like problems. Mom may have worked in the city for 14, 15 hours a day, might not even see mom that day. Might see her boyfriend show up drunk, you know. I mean, there are real problems that kids in poverty have to deal with that those other kids don't. And I think that the only way that some administrators or some district leaders know how to deal with that kind of problem is to lock them down and just do what we're supposed to do. I've seen the effects of privatization in several different cities, anywhere from the Mountain West to North Carolina to New York. Obviously they don't perform any better. Some of them don't necessarily perform any worse than public schools, but I have noticed that when I talk about that lockdown scenario, that no excuses, sit down and get it done, this is all about the test score, those privatized charters and other privatized co-locations and stuff like that are even worse, as far as sit down, be quiet, we don't have time to play around. And I think that's probably the worst thing you can do for a community that's already being disenfranchised like that. I think we should be teaching kids self-discipline as well as respect for other people. You don't teach that by telling them they can't get up and they can't do this, and that doesn't teach discipline. What teaches discipline is giving kids an idea that they have some hope, that they have some gifts that they can use, that they have some kind of idea that they can share things with other people and that those other people are going to be happy about it. Most of those kids, the only attention they get is making other people mad or hurting other people. And they don't care whether or not it's validated or not. They just want to know that they're doing something that makes people, notice them. But I've noticed that if you can turn the entire system of the school around so that it focuses on what can we do to make these kids realize that they have some power through their thoughts, through their knowledge, they start to calm down a little bit because they start realizing that their energies can be used for something that makes them feel good, rather than getting in trouble. It's just a fact of being a teenager especially, and even a littler kid, that you will find attention any way you can. And it's up to us to guide that.